Tensions are rising at colleges and universities across the U.S. as pro-Palestinian protests continue to unfold and grow in places. Students at an encampment at New York's Columbia University are digging in as they face a deadline to dismantle their camp today.
Free, free, free Palestine!
Free, free, free Palestine!
The pro-Palestinian protests at Columbia University have spread across the country. There have been dozens, if not hundreds, of arrests. A central demand from the protesters is that the universities divest themselves from Israeli-linked companies they say are profiting from the war in Gaza. The University of Southern California, USC, has already canceled next month's commencement ceremonies over these protests. Well, for more on this, it's time to zero in with Evan Solomon. Evan is a CTV News political contributor and G0 Media publisher. Evan, thank you as always for joining us.
Great to see you, Roger.
What do you make of the protests? Columbia is pretty much outside your window there. Your thoughts on what's unfolding there?
Yeah, we've had our teams there covering it pretty extensively, but it's happened across the country. Look, this is a classic case of free speech versus safe space. In the United States, that would be the First Amendment, the right to speak freely, and something called Title VI. Title VI was part of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which means that any body that receives any federal funding, a lot of universities do, cannot make anybody feel unsafe or participate in discrimination. So this is at the heart of this tension. And of course, it's exacerbated by the events in Gaza. Now, there's lots of ways to understand this. Obviously, the complexity here is, Roger, both sides feel very much victimized. The Jewish student body say, do you remember October 7th? 1,200 people massacred. There are hundreds of hostages from an organization called Hamas, which is a listed terrorist organization in Canada and the United States. The Palestinian side says, well, wait a second. Since then, the flattening of Gaza, according to the Gaza Health Authority, over 33,000 people, thousands of them children, have been killed. The ongoing threats to incur on Rafah has been ruthless and brutal. And so they feel victimized. Now, I'm not here to compare sides and judge both sides. It's a very dramatic and difficult situations. A couple things. It has become unhelpful, and I wrote an article about this today, to use terms like pro-Palestinian and pro-Israel. Why? Because often what has happened in these big rallies, at any campus here, Roger, is that amongst the genuine protest about the Israeli actions in Gaza, there often have been signs like, we support Hamas or October 7th, and these kind of horrific, very disturbing signs supporting a terror group. But there are many Palestinians that want a free, viable, safe Palestinian state, which has been the goal for generations, that do not support Hamas at all. By the same token, in Israel, there are many Israelis, millions of them, who have protested against the policies of Benjamin Netanyahu, even before October 7th, that, of course, support the right of Israel to exist as a country, but do not support the policies of the government. And it's kind of like saying, are you pro-Canada or anti-Canada or pro-Italy or anti-Italy? There is a difference between supporting, let's say, the right for the Palestinians to have a safe and viable state and supporting Hamas, or Israel to have a safe existing country and not support the government. In the same way here in the United States or in Canada, people are patriotic about their country, but they may not like their government. And that's really important. But on campus, those distinctions are being lost. And so people think, well, if you're, quote, pro-Palestinian, you might be supporting Hamas. I should just finish by saying that is a strategic goal of Hamas. The Hamasification of the Palestinian movement, saying, I support Palestine, meaning I support Hamas. They're very different. Or in Israel, I support Israel, therefore you necessarily support Benjamin Netanyahu's policies. And again, not to make a false equivalency between the two, But we should be very careful understanding what's going on. But these campus protests are divided into two large groups yelling at each other, and you lose these nuances as people are forced to take a side, and that plays into the hands of the radicals. And that's where we now think, what's the political impact of these if they continue?
There's so many questions on this. I mean, the chaos this is creating, because police and officials have a difficult decision on who do they decide that they're going to pick out of these crowds to kind of calm it down a little bit, because it's building and that tension is building, and they're in a difficult spot to make decisions on who they arrest or when do they end a protest. When does it become not just pro-Palestinian, but also now it's pro-Hamas? Because we've heard some horrible things and seen some terrible signs of those at the demonstration.
And again, we should distinguish between the two. There are many people that are, they want a Palestinian safe state. That's the position of the Canadian government, the U.S. government, but that does not mean they support Hamas. So that's the first thing. And you're right. The security issue, the challenge to university administrators who haven't done a good job, the challenge to politicians who have often used this to wedge their own particular agendas is really, really difficult. And it's exacerbating the situation. You do need to provide campuses safe spaces to protest, but they also have to be for free speech, but they also have to be safe space for all students. And, in the United States, police on campus has a long history going back, of course, to the 1960s, culminating in the riots in 1968 at the Democrat National Convention. By the way, that was in Chicago then, it's going to be in Chicago now. So the question is, where's this going? Look, this is going to have a political impact. It already is. Will young people not vote for Joe Biden because they've just passed an aid package that combined aid for Ukraine and aid for Israel as well? And so does Biden take a hit on that? So will young people not turn out for Joe Biden in key swing states like Michigan, which Joe Biden will definitely need, where there's a very large Arab American population? Mm-hmm. Does that kind of thing play out? Will these student protests continue? Look, we're going to see cancellation of graduation, virtual graduation. I feel bad for a lot of the kids. But if it does continue and this becomes a kind of redux of 1968, are you going to see real disruption around this particular issue in the months to come? And that will have a destabilizing effect. At this point, we have to wait and see. Unlike in 68, we haven't seen the emergence of, very well-known national sort of student leaders like you had back in 1968. That hasn't happened yet. But remember, this is growing. It is not diminishing. And how the police conduct themselves on campuses and how the students conduct themselves, how the administrators handle that, will decide the level of whether this becomes, student protest, massive political consequential action in an election year.
Now, and go beyond, you mentioned about Hamas wanting to see this becoming almost a pro-Hamas. How does that benefit them here in North America, or are they playing to other audiences when they're trying to do that?
You have to remember, before October 7th, Hamas was kind of an irrelevant force, right? The Palestinian Authority was kind of the big voice, and that what was happening in Gaza. And just so folks remember, Gaza's mostly, in 1995, Israel pulled out all settlements from Gaza. Gaza's got entrances into Israel and then on the south into Egypt. But look, it was not, no one's going to paint a high economic picture of what was going on in Gaza, governed by Hamas. The Palestinian Authority governs the West Bank. Those two in the 90s had a big war over who's going to govern. So there was instability. After October 7th and the massacre on the 7th, Hamas has now emerged as the driving force. It is a huge propaganda victory because the protests around the world are in support of, obviously, the Palestinian cause for obvious reasons, but it's very difficult to distinguish between support for that and support for Hamas. Hamas wants that. That's part of their strategic goal. In the same way that Benjamin Netanyahu, please, again, I'm not comparing Hamas and Netanyahu, an elected government. These are political descriptions, not false equivalencies. But Netanyahu's strategic goal is to try to align his political strategy with the overall interests of Israel. That's what governments try to do, despite the fact that there are massive protests against him in Israel. So you are seeing domestic politics on each side and strategic politics playing out, not just in the region, but then on campuses. And that's pretty consequential when it comes to how the world is responding to this tragic and it's an ongoing situation in Gaza as this war continues, and at this moment shows very few signs of letting up.
Okay. Evan, always love your perspective. Thank you, sir.
Roger, great to talk.
Evan Solomon is our CTV News political contributor and G0 Media publisher.